There is a quiet, devastating beauty in the meeting of two survivors who have learned to live without a safety net. When the broken, abandoned son and the mistreated, imprisoned daughter cross paths, they are not merely two individuals entering a room. They are two entirely distinct architectures of human defense colliding in the dark. As the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung once wrote, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Their collision is precisely this kind of alchemical event. To understand their union, we must first map the wilderness they inhabited before their names ever became a shared language. These were not just people who had difficult childhoods. They are survivors of two completely different and yet highly sophisticated forms of psychological warfare. For the daughter, childhood was a state of hyper-confinement, an environment saturated with endless surveillance, emotional enmeshment, and the forced erasure of her identity. For the son, childhood was a vast echoing desert of hyper-neglect, a cold vacuum where no one was coming to save him, to protect him, or to tell him he was worthy. When they meet, the cage and the desert recognize each other. For the daughter, safety was found in shrinking, in anticipating the storm, and in waiting. For the son, safety was found in running, in building, and in never allowing himself to look back. To build a bridge between these two worlds requires more than the fleeting spark of romantic chemistry. It requires a radical alchemical transformation of their very survival instincts, turning their walls into windows and their armor into a shared sanctuary. To understand the daughter's starting point, we must first look closely at the invisible structure of her childhood home. The tragedy of the imprisoned daughter's upbringing is that her mistreatment was never delivered with a clenched fist, a raised voice, or an obvious display of cruelty. Instead, it was administered with a warm smile, gentle sighs, and the modern clinical language of self-care. Here, we must examine a highly insidious modern pathology: the weaponization of hyper-individualism. The mother in this family system is a master of emotional containment, utilizing the sacred concepts of boundaries and protecting her peace as tools of total psychological control. She has mutated these concepts, turning them from healthy ways of relating into an absolute authoritarian regime. In this household, peace does not mean harmony, mutual respect, or deep emotional safety. It means the absolute, uninterrupted silence of dissent. It means that the mother's fragile ego is never challenged, her history of unhealed wounds is never questioned, and her total control over the narrative remains pristine. This is what family therapists call enmeshment, a state of psychological boundarylessness where the mother cannot tell where her own identity ends and her daughter's begins. In this suffocating environment, the daughter is not allowed to exist as a separate entity. She is forced to live as an extension of her mother's ego, a mirror to reflect her virtues, a container for her anxieties, and most importantly, a servant to her emotional whims. As the psychoanalyst Alice Miller wrote in her seminal work, The Drama of the Gifted Child, the child learns early to read the mother's need and suppress her own. We must dwell deeply on this tragedy, for the gift Alice Miller spoke of is not an intellectual blessing, but an exquisite and yet sharp emotional radar. The daughter, from her earliest infancy, was forced to develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to the emotional atmosphere of her environment. She became a highly trained meteorologist of her mother's moods. She learned to read the microscopic tightening of a jaw, the faint shift in the cadence of a sigh, the subtle chill in a room when her mother felt underappreciated or threatened. This is not a natural developmental milestone. It is a survival adaptation born of a emotional instability. Over time, the daughter's body begins to absorb the stress of constantly monitoring her environment. This is what we call somatization. Somatization. The process where the mind's unexpressed trauma is translated into physical symptoms. Her nervous system becomes permanently set to high alert, holding the tension of her household in her shoulders, her jaw, her stomach, and her shallow breath. Her body becomes a physical recording of some of the unspoken rules she had to follow just to stay safe. In this system, the daughter learns that her own authenticity is a threat to her safety. If she expresses joy when her mother is suffering, she is accused of cruelty. If she expresses sorrow when her mother demands validation, she is accused of self-absorbed ingratitude. Her actual selfhood is systematically starved, pushed into the shadows, and replaced by what psychoanalysts call the false self. It is a beautifully constructed and highly compliant and, of course, hypervigilant persona designed to solely pacify the mother's fragile psychological landscape. Because the daughter is treated as an extension of the mother's ego, she is denied the basic human right of psychological separation. If she excels, her achievements are instantly hijacked by the mother, who parades them to the world as trophies of her own superior parenting. Yet, if the daughter shines too brightly, she encounters the toxic undercurrent of maternal envy, a quiet but lethal resentment that punishes her for possessing the youth, vitality, or freedom that the mother feels she has lost. She becomes a mirror designed only to reflect the mother's idealized self-image. Back to her, of course. If the mirror is distorted, if it dares to show a wrinkle, a flaw, or a separate identity, the mother seeks to shatter it. Furthermore, the daughter is forced to act as an emotional container, a psychic landfill, for all the unhealed anxieties, regrets, and self-hatred that her mother refuses to face within herself. The mother dumps her emotional garbage onto the child, expecting the daughter to hold the weight of it, to soothe her, to reassure her, and to tell her she is a good mother, even as she is actively erasing her child's identity. This is the essence of parentification, a profound violation of boundaries where the parent abdicates their role and forces the child to become their emotional caretaker, the counselor, and stabilizer. The daughter trades her childhood, her playfulness, and her very sanity to buy a temporary fleeting peace in a home where the rules change with a very easily. Truly, honestly, where the rules change with every maternal whim. She kind of learns how to exist only in relation to what she can do for others. She completely loses touch with her own internal compass, her own desires, and even her voice. And to keep her fortress standing, or rather the mother's fortress standing, the mother must control the borders of the family. This is where we encounter the phenomenon of maternal gatekeeping. In this system, the daughter's father is either physically absent or emotionally exiled. He has been systematically pushed to the margins of the daughter's life. The Exile does not occur because he didn't care, but because the mother holds on to grievances like jewelry. The family systems pioneer Ivan Basamorny Nagy, I know I'm saying that wrong, spoke of invisible loyalties, the unconscious ledger of debts and merits that govern family behavior. The mother maintains a psychological ledger that can never be balanced. She uses past disappointments, real or manufactured, to justify the total emotional quarantine of the father. By demonizing him, she achieves a dual victory. She punishes him eternally, and she forces her daughters into a forced loyalty pact. To love the father, to seek his protection, or even to recognize his humanity is treated as the ultimate act of treason against the maternal state. The daughter is left in a state of chronic, agonizing suspension. She is constantly waiting for a father who cannot reach her through the mother's fortress, and she is waiting for a mother whose love is always conditional on the total surrender of her autonomy. She learns to live with a divided heart, constantly censoring her love for the father to keep the mother's peace from shattering. A gatekeeper, however, cannot police a fortress alone. The mother requires an accomplice, and she finds one in the older sister. Having sacrificed her own individuality much earlier in order to survive, the older sister has fully internalized the mother's rigid and unforgiving laws. She has struck a tragic bargain. She has traded her authenticity for temporary safety and a seat at the right hand of power. Because she gave up her own freedom, she cannot tolerate the younger daughter's attempt to claim hers. The older sister becomes the deputy enforcer of the household. She acts as the mother's eyes, ears, and voice. When the younger daughter attempts to speak the truth, to point out the injustice of the father's exile or the suffocation of the enmeshment, the older sister leads the assault. She mocks the younger sister's emotional death, labeling her as too sensitive, dramatic, or ungrateful to the woman who sacrificed everything. This creates a scene of isolation for the younger daughter. She is betrayed by the very person who should have been her natural ally in the nursery. The older sister's cruelty is born of envy, a deep, unacknowledged resentment of the younger siblings' softness and courage. In the system, love is treated as a scarce commodity. The sisters are pitted against one another in this desperate competition for the crumbs of the mother's approval. The daughter is left completely alone, trapped in a house where her mother is her warden and her sister is her guard. Now, while the daughter was being suffocated by structure, the son was being hollowed out by its absence. The abandoned son is the boy who grew himself out of the ground. Whether his abandonment was physical, a father who walked out and a mother who checked out, or emotional, he was left to navigate the world without a compass. In psychology, we talk about the necessity of mirroring, the process by which a child learns who they are by seeing their emotions, their worth, and their beauty reflected in the loving eyes of a caregiver. The son grew up in front of a blank mirror. He learned very early that the adults in his life were either dangerous, volatile, or most likely unreliable. In the silence of this neglect, he reached a solemn conclusion. No one is coming to save me. If I am to survive, I must become my own parent, my own protector, and most importantly, my own God. In traditional psychology, this self-creation is often praised as resilience, but its shadow side is a deep, chronic loneliness. The son built his entire life on the foundation of defense. His primary operating system is simple. If I never depend on anyone, no one can ever abandon me again. He is a master of self-reliance, developing a hyper-independent armor that protected his vulnerable heart from the agony of rejection. He learned to work harder, run faster, and feel less. He convinced himself that his independence was his greatest strength, failing to see that it was also his most secure prison. Because there was no loving, protective adult to guide the son, he had to internalize a parental figure on his own. But without a healthy, compassionate model, he internalized a tyrant. His inner critic is relentless and unforgiving master. This voice demands absolute perfection in his work, his physique, his finances, and his emotion. It tells him that any sign of weakness, exhaustion, or doubt is a precursor to total collapse. He believes that if he lets his guard down for even a second, the ground will open up and swallow him, just as it did when he was an unprotected child. And his And Terrence Real's work on male depression, I don't want to talk about it. He describes this state as a covert depression, unlike overt depression, which is characterized by sadness and low energy. Covert depression is characterized by profound numbness, specifically emotional numbness, obsessive workaholism, and an absolute refusal of vulnerability. The son does not know how to grieve his childhood, so he channels his pain into performance. He offers the world and eventually his partner physical protection, financial stability, and dry, logical intelligence. But he keeps his raw, unvarnished humanity hidden behind a thick wall of stone. And he has survived by becoming hard, and he deeply distrusts anything that threatens to make him soft. When the self-made son and the silenced daughter first meet, there is an immediate electric recognition of each other's strength. They do not see two wounded children, they see two heroic survivors. The daughter is drawn to the son's solid, unshakable presence, to her hyper-vigilant nervous system. His quietness feels like safety, and his independence feels like a shield against her mother's enmeshment. The son is drawn to the daughter's deep, expressive emotional capacity. To his numb, intellectualized world, her warmth feels like a fire in the dead of winter. They believe they have found their sanctuary. They believe that their love will be simple because they have both already survived the worst the world could throw at them. But this initial peace is illusion. As their intimacy deepens, they move past the polite boundaries of dating and enter the deep and mostly volatile waters of true connection. It is there that their survival strategies, the very tools that kept them alive as children, begin to turn against them, triggering a painful, unconscious dance of projection and defense. The daughter, having survived by reading the shifting, unpredictable moods of her mother, has an incredibly sensitive radar for emotional distance. When the son withdraws into his quiet, self-critical space, as he inevitably does whenever he feels overwhelmed or imperfect, the daughter's nervous system goes into a state of high alert. She does not see a man who is tired of processing his thoughts. She sees the cold shoulder of her mother. She sees the contemptuous, silent exile of her father. Terrified of being abandoned and locked out of the relationship, she pursues him, demanding emotional validation and reassurance. But because her bids for connection are driven by fear, they often come out as anger, criticism, or frantic demands. To the son, this pursuit is terrifying. Having grown himself out the dirt, he guards his autonomy with his life. When the daughter demands to know what he is feeling or why he is quiet, he does not hear a bid for love. He hears a suffocating, intrusive trap of maternal control. He hears an attempt to invade his borders, dismantle his self-protection, and consume his identity. His nervous system screams that he is about to be buried alive, and in response, he does the only thing he knows how to do: survive. He hardens, becomes deeply analytical, and withdraws into a cold, dismissive silence. This, children, is the tragedy of the trauma loop. The more she pursues, the more he withdraws. The more he withdraws, the more frantic she becomes. In this painful space, they begin to unconsciously play the scripts of the very households they fled. The daughter, out of deep hurt, may begin to hold grudges, withholding her warmth and gatekeeping her heart to protect herself from his rejection. Without realizing it, she begins to use her mother's manual of emotional warfare. treating the son as her mother treated her father. The son, feeling judged, criticized, and found wanting, feels his original wound of abandonment rip wide open. He tells himself that he was never enough for his parents and he will never be enough for her. He concludes that love is a trap and that he is safer alone in his desert. They are no longer fighting each other. They are fighting the ghost of their childhoods, using their partner's face as a screen to project their deepest and mostly unhealed terrors. But to break the cycle, the son must undergo inner work. He must realize that his hyper-independence is not strength always, but a sophisticated shield. He must find the courage to dismantle the inner tyrant that he has let rule his mind for his life. But this means that he must learn to be imperfect, to be tired, to be clunky in his emotions without punishing himself. He must take the ultimate risk. He must allow himself to lean on the daughter. He must let her see him when he does not have the answers, when he is afraid, and when he is weak. He must also stop treating her emotional depth as an irrational storm that needs to be fixed or managed. He must understand that her capacity to feel is not a threat to his freedom, but life-giving wisdom that his usually dry, overly intellectualized life desperately needs. As the author Bell Hooks wrote in All About Love, rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. So the son must choose communion over isolation, allowing the daughter's love to soften his stone-cold armor. The daughter's path to healing is equally demanding. She must step out of the role of the perpetual victim and claim her right to exist as an autonomous and, most importantly, self-determined woman. She must perform a grief ritual of sorts for the family she deserved but never had. She must stop wanting for her mother's validation or her older sister's apology. She must accept that they may never understand her, and that their peace was actually her prison. Choosing her own joy, her own voice, and her own relationship is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of loyalty to her own soul. Furthermore, she must separate her father's true identity from her mother's grudge-filled narrative. She must allow herself to seek an independent relationship with him, free from the maternal surveillance that taught her to fear the masculine. By healing her relationship with her father, she heals her relationship with the masculine energy within herself and within her partner. She stops seeing the son as an impending abandoner and begins to see him as her greatest ally. When both partners commit to this healing, they must develop an entirely new dialect of intimacy. They must stop fighting in code. A destructive cycle where surface level arguments are about household chores, schedules, or the tone of a voice are used as proxy battlegrounds for deep-seated, mostly existential terrors. When we fight in code, we use trivial irritations to scream about our fear of being abandoned, erased, or even suffocated. To break this destructive pattern, they must practice what psychologists call conscious naming. This is the act of somatic translation, where they learn to take the raw, non-verbal panic of their aroused nervous systems and put it into gentle words, vulnerable words. This means that in moments of sudden tension, instead of immediately launching an attack or fleeing into withdrawal, they pause to actively narrate their survival states to each other in real time. This requires them to speak directly from the raw wound itself rather than biting or hiding behind their heavy armor. For the daughter, this means resisting the frantic urge to chase him down with emotional demands. Instead of screaming accusations like, "You are so cold, you never listened to me, you're just like my sister," she learns to pause, locate the physical grip of fear in her body, and speak her truth. "Hey, I'm feeling anxious because you went quiet." The silence that you have made feels like the emotional quarantine of my childhood home. My brain is telling me that I'm being abandoned, that I'm invisible, and that my voice has been erased. And I know you're not my mother, and I know you need space to breathe, but right now I'm terrified. I need you to look at me and reassure me that we are still okay. She is no longer demanding validation through anger. She is revealing her vulnerability as an invitation for connection. For the son, this means halting his habit of stonewalling, the deep protective retreat into the cold silence where he shuts his partner out instead of running into his analytical mind or dismissing her as emotional. He learns to notice the heavy pressure in his chest and say, "I'm feeling overwhelmed and criticized right now. And my instinct is screaming at me to run away." When your voice rises and I don't hear a bid for love, I hear the suffocating trap of control. I feel like a little boy who is failing to be perfect, and I feel like I am about to be buried alive. I know you're not trying to trap or control me, and I know you're just scared. I'm not going to leave you. But I really need 10 minutes to breathe and regulate. If you let me step away to my internal storm, I promise you I will come back and hold you and talk through this. This simple yet radical act of truth-telling completely dismantles the trauma loop. Neurobiologists often refer to this as neural integration, or what Dr. Dan Siegel famously calls naming it to tame it. By putting words to their panic, they are redirecting the electrical storm from the survival centers of the brain to the calming centers of conscious awareness. They are taking the terrifying lightning of their trauma and grounding it safely in the earth of their shared compassion. They are no longer speaking at each other from behind their defenses. They are speaking to each other about their defenses. They are no longer puppets of their past reacting blindly to the ghosts of their childhoods. They are two conscious adults choosing to co-create safety in the present moment. Through this practice, they build a new sanctuary, a relationship built not on the fragile foundation of codependency, but on the unshakable ground of his interdependence. They become each other's safe space, practicing the art of co-regulation. They begin to live out the truth of the profound insight by physician Gabriel Mate. Safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. It is this presence, this warm, steady, almost atonement for everything that they had gone through, that changes everything. When the daughter's cage trauma is triggered, the son no longer flees. He stands firm like an oak tree, anchors his presence, wraps his arms around her, and offers his physical warmth. He holds her through the shaking, breathing with her, and repeating, "I see you. You are safe here. I'm." When the son's abandonment trauma is triggered and his inner critic begins to tear him down, the daughter does not chase or demand performance. She softens his armor, takes off his shoulder pads, rubs his shoulders, and speaks to him in his ear about his daily efforts, about how great he doesn't see himself to be, which finally allows him to rest, to ensure their victory over their inherited blueprints. They must sit down and write the laws of their own house. They write a new covenant. that rejects the weaponized peace of the mother, the envious cruelty of the older sister, the hyper-individualism of modern survival, and the cold isolation of the self-made man. In their new house, vulnerability is not a weakness, it is the ultimate currency of connection. Softness is not dangerous, it is the soil in which their love grows. Truth-telling is not seen as betrayal. It is the foundation of their safety. They build their life on the understanding that they are stronger together, and that deepening on each other is not sin or surrender of freedom, but the ultimate expression of it. And in this sanctuary, the daughter is finally allowed to have a distinct and beautiful and unrestricted silhouette. She is no longer the prisoner or the scapegoat. She is a woman who is free to love and be loved. The son is finally allowed to lay down his heavy sword and his towering shields. He is no longer the lonely soldier or the parent to himself. He is a man who is allowed to receive grace. They are, at last, just two human beings who looked at the ruins of their respective childhoods and chose to build a palace of tenderness, safety, and most importantly, an unshakable adoration. They have survived the cage, they have crossed the desert, and now they are going across the Nile, and together in each other's arms, they have finally learned how to live.